we'll get started. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. Thanks again to XPO Logistics for that. Just a few, again, quick housekeeping notes before we kick off. We're going to have a shortened coffee break after this session, in an effort to kind of get out a bit sooner. So after we close this session, around about 2:45, we'll take about 15 minutes. They'll open the room back up, and we'll all come together again for the last session for about an hour or so. And again, sorry to bang on about this, but there's feedback forms on the desk or on the chairs. So if you could please fill those in if you haven't already, and make sure that you either leave them there or get them to a member of our team. They are really important to us to understand what we can do better for the upcoming years. And with all the events we have in North America now, your voice and opinion is very, very important. There's a box of Fortnum or a tin of Fortnum Mason biscuits or cookies as a giveaway, which I like to say are the Queen's favorite. I think it's a lie I actually made up and keep telling audiences, but I'm going to stick to it. Okay, great. So in this session, this is the supplier Crossfire. I had the pleasure of being with Louis today as he rounded up each of these speakers on fairly short notice. But obviously, they're being experts in logistics, they can handle quick changes and reactions as such. I'd like to just introduce the panel. Can we have the slide up, please, for that to help me out, please, to our AV people? Thank you. We're not going to have any presentations. We're just going to do a Q&A and have a chance for dialogue. So I'll just introduce the panel. Michael Silvio, who some of you have already seen at the conference on stage, Director of Supply Chain Management at Cooper Standard. Thomas Isaacs is Strategic Logistics North America for Grupo Antolin. Elliot Swiss, Director of Inbound Logistics at General Motors. And Danette Beltnik, Global Logistics Manager at Inteva Products. So it's a panel that reflects very well the diversity in the tier supply chain. It's almost difficult to talk about a tier supply chain when there's so many different commodities, so many different kinds of parts, components. I'm not sure how much there might be to share between a rubber supplier and a powertrain or whatever. It's obviously quite diverse. Just some trends, obviously, you see across the industry with acquisitions and consolidations. There's lots of decentralization for some companies. Perhaps the logistics aren't quite as consolidated as you might see for a large OEM. There might be legacy systems throughout all of those pieces, which I'm sure make life very, very interesting for our logistics managers. One thing clearly we see in North America, and to a certain extent in Europe, but there's capacity challenges coming out of the downturn, and with the increase in production. I think Bill Storrs from Ford yesterday talked about some delivery quality issues having to work on, having to do a lot of that chasing as such. So again, I'm sure our panel can speak to that and speak to how their companies are managing that and handling that and helping to avoid any line stoppages. Obviously a big theme. In fact, the theme of our conference last year, I think, was Made in America, all about the shifts in some sourcing and the growth, again, in local manufacturing and localization within North America. Obviously, that means that brings changes to the tier supply chain, which is still nevertheless very global and very dispersed and very, very different from company to company. I've also heard of some tier suppliers more recently making efforts to build integrated TMS systems, sometimes on a global scale, which can obviously have a big impact in how the logistics are run. And of course, Mexico and what the growth there means. So those are just maybe a few really high-level points from my side, which I kind of see as relevant to maybe what we'll discuss. I'd like to start by asking each of our panel members to briefly introduce themselves, maybe talk a little bit about their responsibilities, a brief snapshot perhaps of the network that we're dealing with, just so we can kind of ground ourselves in where we are and what we're talking about. So if we can start with Mike.
Okay, hi, I'm Mike Silvio from Cooper Standard. I'm responsible for logistics, customs, North America, global freight forwarding, indirect purchasing, packaging engineering, and purchasing technology at Cooper Standard. And from a logistics standpoint, we operate more of a centralized system where the plants really don't make many decisions regarding logistics. It's all made centrally by teams that I have here in the Detroit area and also down in Torreon, Mexico. And we tend to control all the decisions and all the frequencies and transit times and whatever the plant needs so they can focus on making great parts.
Great, thank you.
You'll have to excuse me, please. This is the first panel I've been on. I was a long-term discussion with Louis on whether or not to attend as a Tier 1. So what I'd like to offer is my position as strategic logistics is a reflection of my approach. Grupo Antolin currently has 12 locations in North America. We started excuse me, with what is both a traditional European model, but also a fairly typical American model of decentralization, where every plant in North America has literally managed its own logistics contracts, everything start to finish, and started a process of centralization about 5 years ago. It has involved a significant amount of education on my part as we discovered 37 customs brokers and 42 different carriers, some contracts that were by virtue of email. What I'd like to offer for a different perspective, especially in the context of what I've been listening to the last 2 days, is that I am a working logistics person, meaning that I have just a small enough group to be able to go down to a MP&L planner level. So there's some comments that I think are relevant as far as whether we are living in a hierarchical sort of cloud, because if we don't recognize what our people are doing with everything that we have done over or talked about in the last 2 days, then we should improve that. So this is some of my perspectives. I am Elliot. Is a legend. I was commenting on the fact that I had never met in 5 years a significant OEM executive in the logistics field, so the fact that I'm sitting next to Elliot is just incredible.
So my name is Elliot Swiss. I have inbound logistics for GM, and Tom, I'll pay you later after the panel. So I think, I'm with an OEM. The other panel members are with Tier 1s. I think the one thing that we found we all have in common is we made the mistake of making eye contact with Louis at lunch. Breakfast. Oh, it was yours breakfast? You had plenty of notice. I'm surprised you didn't ask for a presentation. So in terms of the GM network, our inbound logistics network in North America is obviously pretty big. We pick up at about 4,000 supplier DUNS locations, deliver into 40-plus manufacturing locations, U.S., Mexico, Canada. If I would have had a little more notice, I would have put my metrics chart on the screen. I know some of the guys in the audience know it better than I do. But just to give you a feel for the scale of the network, we run about 25,000 trucks per week in our network. We are also very centrally organized. All the strategy, all the sourcing decisions are all done centrally. We're heavily dependent on our LLPs that design our routes and then execute locally at our plants.
Good afternoon. My name is Danette Beltink, and I am the Global Logistics Manager for Intiva Products. My responsibilities include all of the inbound raw materials worldwide for all of our facilities. We manufacture in 18 different countries for about 24 different manufacturing facilities. Worldwide, we have about 40 different facilities, including sales and tech centers. We do everything with my team that consists of cradle to grave, from contracting, engineering support, sales support, anything you can think of across the board, my team is responsible for.
So there's me proven wrong pretty much across the board on the panel. I mentioned decentralization. It sounds like we've got a group which has at least worked towards centralization, if not already quite centralized. But nonetheless, I think that is probably an important aspect of the chain. I think, one of it's high level, so this question, but it's worth asking. I think it's one that Louis mentioned we would discuss a little bit. If we could just maybe talk a little bit about what you see as some of the differences between what it is to manage, let's say from Elliot's side, managing the tier supply chain inbound for assembly versus your piece or the tier supplier's piece inbound to their factories. It's a very high-level question, but maybe just to get our discussion going, maybe Elliot, you can start from your observations, since you also spend time in purchasing as well, so you've had some different perspectives too.
Okay. I guess, I think, no two tier ones, I think, are the same, right? I mean, Grupo Antolin is different than Cooper Standard, is different than Magna. Some are centralized, some are decentralized. So I guess it's not easy to answer that generically. We've done some kind of collaboration studies, a little bit of benchmarking with some of the bigger tier ones, and what you find out is, we're all managing the same issues. At the end of the day, it's just a question of, how big is the scale of your network? Are you using an LLP? Are you not using an LLP? But, I think the issues are the issues, right? I mean, how do we get better density in our conveyances? One of the things that hasn't come up a lot at the conference that I guess you guys are probably, managing too is truck driver shortages, especially in North America. So, from what I've seen, and again, I've not managed at a tier one, but from what I've seen, we're all managing the same issues. It's just a question of, how's your company structured? Are you centralized, decentralized? Are you part of purchasing? Are you part of manufacturing? But I would think that all of our jobs are probably very similar.
Any of the tier suppliers want to comment about your side?
I'll be happy to lead. I'm going to agree with Elliot insofar as yes. I'd like to think that it's very common. An OEM's approach to the tier is very similar probably to a 3PL's. You put the quarter in the gumball machine and it's going to come out round, different colors, so we all have different needs. I don't necessarily see the same connection or focus between an OEM down to the tier insofar as had very interested listening to the gentleman from Honda this morning in his roundtable as he was talking about directly managing suppliers. I think that as an OEM, managing a supplier or possibly sub-suppliers network is possible. I think it would be a very different perspective for a tier one to be able to actually reach out and touch, demand, dictate, control a supply base of tier two or below. I don't know that I think we're necessarily equipped for that. And I don't know whether or not we would actually ask a 3PL to do so. So in that respect, I think we're vastly different.
We are different, and Cooper Standard is in the unique position of being both a tier one and a tier two. So we not only understand, how our customers work with us, but we also have some of your tier one providers that are trying to work with us. And as it goes through the tier system, it becomes much more difficult. And so we've learned a lot from that experience in terms of how we manage our supply base. And it's certainly not easy to make sure everybody's working together and making sure all the material arrives on time. And our small network is certainly much easier to manage than what you have, so we can do much of it on our own with expertise that we've gained from our people and our systems. So it's different. There's no question about it. And each tier looks at their organization different, whether it's run through purchasing or through manufacturing. I often, sometimes I thought, well, it's a philosophy how you want to structure your company, but it's also based on the people that you have and the skills that they have in place. And sometimes it's just the right fit because that's where a person is located.
Thank you for that. From the point of view, Grupo Antolin, mentioning about how not necessarily having the capabilities to reach into the tier two. But are your delivery terms X works from them? Are you consolidating from your tier two suppliers or working towards that? Or is it different between Europe and North America now? Those gentlemen, they can't.
Well, when we're working with our tier twos, we generally want to control the freight. We want to know where it's at and how it's managed. And we try to provide them, and this is the tricky part, is actually a firm and consistent demand signal. So they know exactly what to ship and when to ship it. and realizing from being on the Tier 2 side that we don't always get that. So there's a bit of a whipping effect. Even though we know that an OEM's signal is very consistent and there's a firm number and there's very little fluctuation on a day-to-day basis, as it gets down to the second and third level, it really starts to, I mean, it can fluctuate 300, 400% in a day. And so we try to, understand that happens and try to create the level loading that they need to manage their production, and it also helps us manage our transportation.
Yes, no, and maybe. I think that the technical flesh out to that is, once again, Grupo Antolin is a fairly large tier with respect to several $1 billion, but we don't necessarily have the economies of scale to singly address, I guess, a uniform strategy. We would have a multi-pronged strategy, which is where the answer to your question comes in, and yes. There are ways where we are focusing on international transportation. We are not large enough, nor is our product demand an intermodal interface, but we have done things as far as moving ports this year, serving OEMs. Being a Spanish company, we have quite a bit of Mercedes, BMW business, Volkswagen business, which have a fairly high demand from Europe. We have Chinese sourcing, which comes in through different modes. We have 5 or 6 plants in Mexico of our own, with a vertical integration strategy in doors and overheads. We have a very broad, and again, I kind of would like to throw this out because I'm not certain whether this is typical of us as a tier. I know there are tiers of much larger nature or more focused commodities like Magnas, JCIs, who are 4 and 5 and 6 times our size, who have a very precise focus like Glenn and seating for Forcia. But we have a very broad structure based on our commodities, based on our regional locations, and in our respect also as our 3PL has to deal with, we have to have a multiple strategies with all different aspects of the supply chain. This is not only related to transportation. Well, we have to be multilingual. We have to deal with EDI transactions throughout several, several countries, trying to get, working groups, being able to interface through a purchasing organization to supplier contacts that are in multiple other countries. So it's quite varied for the tier, very broad basis, and not a lot of mass to necessarily be able to bring to the table.
I think one of the things we do very, very much so at Intiva is concentrate on the total cost. So when you hit on one of the keywords of Incoterm, I don't think that there's one Incoterm that is going to set precedence for every single supplier or OD pair that you want to take a look at. So that when you're taking a look at something, you want to keep an eye on what the total cost is going to be. So it can't be DDP or XWorks or FCA for everything or everyone. So we try very hard at Intiva to keep an eye on total cost. So that's one thing that we strive very much so for.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any questions or comments from the audience at this time? Well, maybe you can each talk a little bit about the 3PL and/or LLP relationships that you have. I mean, we know GM's is pretty public with Ryder managing into U.S. plants and Penske into Mexico, and a variety of services which are maybe outsourced, some which are shifting and insourced, and then maybe everyone else can talk a little bit about their structure. I mean, Elliot, if you want to comment a bit about that to start, obviously.
No, you hit it right. I mean, we're very LLP dependent. Our engineers I would say GM does strategic design. We'll try to understand, where should our consolidation points be, where should we deconsolidate. But I would say from there, the LLPs, Penske and Ryder take over and actually create operating plans with routes. They actually create our transportation orders, manage the transportation into our plants, track milestones, and also do the material follow-up in our plants. So really it's Ryder alerting Ryder when something is going to be late, or Penske alerting Penske. From there, we've got premium freight LLPs. XPO manages, for the most part, our premium freight and Active Air, our air charters. GM retains the purchasing aspect of the business, so we do our own sourcing, set our own strategies, do our own supply-based strategies. But like you said, Chris, it's a very LLP heavily dependent model.
Can the others want to start talking about what your models look like?
This is how.
We're in this together, for sure. Well, one of the nice things is that, I got my start at a 3PL, working with Bill Garrett and gaining a lot of experience there. So we came on board at Cooper, myself and another gentleman, with a lot of 3PL experience. And we had the time to sit back and really think about how do we want to approach North American logistics. And what we had decided was that we were going to set the strategy and how we were going to work with each mode. There were some modes that we were going to go direct to the carrier and negotiate ourselves, and there were some things that we knew that we did not want to specialize in, that we did not want to do, and that we should outsource. Now, outsourcing, again, is a third-party approach, and of course, the easy decision is freight payment. No one wants to pay freight bills. It takes a lot of time, it's a lot of effort. You outsource that. But what we realized is that the people that we wanted to work with, whether it be in freight forwarding or in freight payment or in consolidation management, milk run management, is we wanted to partner with somebody that could bring more to the table than just driving a truck. So someone more that just would put a driver on it, run around. If we had a list of suppliers that we wanted them to work with, we wanted them to bring some intelligence to the table on how we could do it better, and that they're required year after year to look at what they do for us and find ways to bring value and make us better. And so choosing that partner, you now take a transactional activity and you make it strategic. You've developed a supplier into a strategic partner that you're really working with in the long haul, and there's measures and there's return on investment in what you put into that relationship, because they need to help you get better, and it's best for everybody.
My LLP is in the room, in the very back, writhing uncontrollably, waiting to see what I'm going to say. My LLP actually found out that I was sitting up at the table about 10 seconds before I sat down. I adore our LLP. It is the first one we've ever had under a centralization strategy. The point I would offer, it was very interesting because I was directly involved with searching for the LLP, and I like to comment on this because we evaluated supply chain management models. We did use a consultant as a sounding board. We looked at agent relationships, carrier relationships, how deep did we want them to go into our management systems. What were the systems and services that we felt were minimum necessities? What were our stretch goals and objectives? There was a very interesting conversation I had with our global logistics, and it was very simple. My question to him was, do you want Starship Enterprise or do you want the Beverly Hillbillies? Because the key word for us as a new Tier 1 was appropriate. The system had been working for 15 years, not necessarily well or graciously, but we carry on, and the company remains profitable. The question became, do we look at landed cost? Do we need to educate ourselves on different modes, different metrics, different indicators? What do we need the 3PL or the LLP to do? And I remember very distinctly, for those many people here have been in the industry for years, I actually had talks originally with Scott and Landstar and looked at large companies, small and medium. And I absolutely remember a gentleman named Lorne from A3i Systems. And he had this computer software that would do everything, including wash your dishes. And it was unfortunately so far beyond what was the needs of our company. So first and foremost, we equally had to determine what do we want, The second piece is we also had to sit back after a year or two and allow our 3PL to teach us what we wanted. I'm certain everybody here in the industry, I can certainly see the gentleman next to me understanding that occasionally what you think you want is not actually what you want. Now we're moving into, I think it's year 5 or 6 of a relationship, and I am actually quite pleased in that we are progressing into EDI connectivity, optimizations, forecasting. We have VAV, engineering and cost optimization programs. We do now understand the differences between modes. I am able to determine what is the difference in a good consolidation model versus LTL model versus a truckload pricing, region-to-region basis, yada, yada, yada. I'm going to add one more thing. The original mission for the tier, I think, at this level was simply to bring order out of chaos. We can no longer afford anywhere in the industry, as led by OEMs. We cannot afford to continue in a non-optimized fashion in anything. It is not a question of cost out. I was in a conference this morning. It's cost yes and yes. We sometimes refer to this as cost yes and cost maybe. I really enjoyed Bill's phrase of cost prophecy. I tend to call it fantasy sometimes, but a cost prophecy. So all these different elements come into play. My challenge then becomes what I think the LLP has to do is it has to have the capability of speaking many languages once it's put the quarter in the gumball machine. And it not only has to be able to speak the languages, it has to be able to interface at the appropriate levels. I am comfortable understanding and talking about cash flow, inventory management, talking with Bill at Sergier's group about whether or not we do a packaging investment, whether GAAP allows it to be a savings against our current interest rates from our short-term line of credit. But that is not what the route manager needs to be talking about with my materials planner team when the truck doesn't show up on time. So I think the LLPs now have a very challenging role, equally as challenging as the tier, because it transitions many levels up and down the organization across many languages. And the LLPs that are able to succeed in this, I think are going to be the LLPs that succeed with the tiers. I think that the tiers who are able to recognize these paradigms and match the LLP to your needs, or then modify your needs, having recognized your own limitations or where you want to go, that's going to come up with the perfect marriage.
I almost forgot your question. Like Mike had mentioned, I as well came from a 3PL. And I think the biggest thing is understanding what a 3PL can do, but also respecting that relationship and understanding the partnership that it can bring to the Tier 1 and what a 3PL or an LLP can bring. And that partnership is really what can enhance the relationship, because the partnership is what will move you forward in understanding what your network can be and what it can become. Because once you have that partnership in place, that's what the future can bring towards your network and the design. And that's the communication and the partnership and bridging that network and bringing it into the future. I have 2 3PLs in the U.S., in Mexico. I have one in Europe, and then also a 3PL like in Asia. Is it enough? Is it too much? Is it too little? My network is still under design and still going to become what that partnership will be in the future. And that's still yet to be seen because that partnership is growing.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, how would you define a kind of 3PL light, you said in Asia, right? What sort of distinguishes 3PL light from...
Well, it's more of a in-house support.
Okay.
More than just an outside network. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it a 3PL, but
yeah,
it's a 3PL-like. Without them, I probably wouldn't succeed nearly as much.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions from the floor at this time? Not even from the LLPs in the room, I guess. But Do you think that, I mean, when you consider the scale, we've been mentioning it earlier, obviously, that the scale at an OEM is so much greater. Does that mean there's more room, more scope for a 3PL LLP to manage some strategic parts of the tier supply chain, perhaps in comparison to the OEM? For anybody who wants it. Okay. Basically, I'm saying is because the tier suppliers lack the scale of a car maker, or whether that's in freight terms or even just in resources internally, does that open the door more for a strategic partnership with an LLP, 3PL, however we want to define it, or not, basically?
I go, okay. I think, you know, the first obstacle for a lot of tier ones to work with a major 3PL in terms of like a lead logistics type of approach is the fact that you know you need a certain amount of volume to gain from that. And there has to be a certain amount of opportunity because these programs don't pay for themselves. It has to be funded through savings. So there has to be a certain amount of activity that will fund it. Oftentimes, and I could speak for like less than truckload, they still propose their pricing based on the amount of business at your firm. And if you team up with a logistics company that has $100 million in LTL freight, they still look at you as you only have $500,000. Okay. And so you don't quite get all that pricing benefit that you would expect. And so when a company gets to be just big enough, you can work directly with the carriers because a lot of carriers don't want that third party in between you and them. Right. So you might get some better pricing possibly. I've done some benchmarking in that regards where it's like, it really isn't the slam dunk to create that party in the middle.
Right.
And certainly if you could get, if I could get the General Motors rates on my truckloads, I'd be interested. But for some reason, the carriers don't want to give me the General Motors rates. So
they may not be as good as you think.
Well, but I mean, and that brings you into the discussion about getting that capacity. Because if I'm going to work with a provider that is taking care of General Motors, how much of his energy and capacity is left for a little guy like me? So I might choose, like I do for a lot of my 3PL activity, is someone that specializes in my market size, like many other tier ones. Like these are guys that really focus on our activity, and because we're not so big and we don't have all that volume, we need something a little different, and we're not a one size fits all. So we might need some things customized a little bit for us. Not that we're any different than anybody else, but we don't have $6 billion in freight. Yeah. We have 50 million. So it's different.
Right.
You betcha. Once again, I think the question was considering the lack of potential, the lack of scale that we were talking about. I guess the conclusion I would actually have to come up to at this point with absolute passion is how could you not? I find it unfortunate and baffling and quite irritating that my company did not start using an LLP or something of that nature long ago. I think the benefits are insurmountable. Excuse me, there's a word I'm looking for. They're just, you can't lose. I'm equally going to agree with the other. What's your name again? Mike. My shattered brain and terrible nerves. As Mike said, once again, I think you have to have a certain economy of scale. You have to have a good size match. I spoke with several companies, and I won't name them, that are absolutely outstanding companies, but they were very comfortable in explaining to me that unless I was Coca-Cola, the way they were structured was I was probably or maybe not necessarily going to get the custom designed hand-holding, or in worst case, a focus on a very unique organization like mine. So therefore, we did absolutely tailor it. And I'm gonna go one step further, because when I shopped, literally, the decision that was made, and it was a decision that was made by me in both the selection and the final choice of our 3PL, was the fact that we were very rough around the edges. We knew we were going to need customization. We knew we needed a tremendous amount of knowledge and skills on all levels in how to begin this journey and doing it correctly. And I'm going to also commit heresy. I hope this doesn't get published. I didn't speak with my marketing department. 5 years ago, I actually did have something that may be unprecedented. I had an in-office meetings with both the global logistics manager and our EVP of industrialization at the time. And both of them looked me in the eye and said, "We'll cover you. We don't care if it saves money." Come to find out, that's an extraordinarily odd statement for an executive as a tier one to make, but they recognized the challenges. Yes, the cost savings came, but it was absolutely necessary for us to start the journey of systems and services and knowledge and skills to begin running our organization correctly. And that is just, you just have to have it. I don't understand how a tier could not have it. You don't get that type of mentoring. Again, we don't get that type of mentoring necessarily from an OEM. There is not a consortium of super intelligent tier ones other than the gentleman from Furcia, who's brilliant. So you either have to learn it on your own or you have to go find a partner. So go find a partner and go be a partner, please. You'll make money, and we're not going to try to drive you out of business. And saving costs is mostly a negotiation, and my understanding is it's all relevant to how hard I beat the business director at the LLP. That's what he tells me.
Thank you.
I think that Mike makes a good point between your volume, your size, your network. It's hard to find that right size of 3PL that can fit, or LLP, whatever you choose to call it, that can fit your network because of the cost that you have to put out. And there's not a one size fits all. That's why there's different sizes of LLPs for different sizes of companies. So you do have to shop around, like you had said before, you have to shop around 8, 10, sometimes a dozen or 2 dozen to find what your needs are that are going to fit right. But I think that it is imperative, if you don't have the expertise on your staff or the skill set, that you shop around, you do find that, because your network does need it. You will suffer if you don't have it, and you will pay in the long run. And you owe it to yourself and your company to find that right fit and that skill set to make sure your network and your company will survive and be successful. And the 3PL will help you do that in the long run.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone for the comments there. Any other points? There we are. Someone's awake. Question in the back.
Hi, my name is Lee Jones with Vascor. One of the things that we've heard throughout yesterday and today is about OEMs collaborating with the tier ones and possibly merging the supply chains. But what I haven't heard a lot about is tier ones partnering together and running your supply chains as a tier one to tier one integration. You look at a map of all the tier ones in the Midwest, and there's tremendous density, many suppliers in the same supplier parks, but you're running completely different networks. I know you just mentioned customization of your own needs, which is important, but there's got to be opportunity for multiple suppliers integrating their networks to create that density for optimization. So if you could comment on that.
Actually, I will. Currently, one of my providers, we work with Ryder Integrated, and they do have a consolidation that they work with one of their teams, and their team is dedicated to consolidating some of their customers' materials together. And that is one thing that I volunteer my freight for, is to look for opportunities for my freight to be put together with other customers' freight. Where we run into some of our issues is, and I'll be honest, is damage and things like that. But I'm willing to take that opportunity or that risk and still throw my hat into that ring. To be honest, we've not been able to successfully launch any of those yet, but it's not stopping me from keeping that in there and keep looking for those opportunities. So that is something that we actively try and look for right now, is keeping our freight in that network, trying to keep myself open to those opportunities to completely look for those cost savings on an ongoing basis.
You know, today's, the first time Thomas and I have met, but we actually go to Mexico together every day because we share a network of consolidation and trucks that go to Mexico. And so where it's very time consuming for two tier ones to get together and try to hunt out the freight and analyze all of our freight together. But when we share the same consolidator, we can do that. And because they see our data and they can combine it, and we can pay for the space that we use. Probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I was with the director of manufacturing at our company, and he had asked me, about this. And before I could tell him what we were doing, he expressed an interest that I visit every supplier park where we have a plant in Mexico and knock on all the doors and ask where their freight was going. And I say, I really don't have time for that. I have 100,000 other shipments to worry about. But then I explained to him how this works, where when you have a good partner that again, creates that solution that you need in terms of, can we consolidate freight? How can we leverage, the activity and pull the freight off LTL into consolidations, and who their customers are that they do this with, the opportunities kind of blossom. But you have to have the willingness to do it, and an organization that has the infrastructure and the customer base to actually accomplish it. So.
I'll agree with that, and also offer that our current 3PL, which we do share in a couple of areas, kind of crept up to me and said, well, we think we've got this thing that can share with so-and-so. Well, of course, I used to work for Lear, and I understand who Magna and JCI and IAC are. So the fact that their factories are where our factories are, I absolutely agree with. Furthermore, if you look at basic concentrations of manufacturing corridors, if you consider the fact that there are commodities like headliners, which are generally going to be focused on the Detroit hub, the Toronto hub, a little bit more decentralized in the south, not that much in Sacramento, then there's a lot of synergy. Equally so, I think the maximum synergy that's available is generally for direct competitors. And I think there are some very profound organizational boundaries as we move into situations beyond simply consolidation into, can we share a milk run? Does the LLP or the 3PL share a large enough block between a regional or point-to-point networks to be able to purchase X and pass identical exceptional pricing on a contractual basis to the same people in the same area? It may not necessarily be in the same 3PL's model to do something that generic and that positive, because it dilutes your own margin. So I think that it is very possible to do things like that. The opportunities exist. I think there are some basic ground rules that would have to be established, and I think you would have to have several very bold characters to start taking on that particular objective beyond just simply a multi-shared managed consolidation network. I know that we have tinkered with it, and my question was very basic. Who's on the truck first, and what happens if I'm second and he's late? Okay, well, let's start from just a pure transportation ops perspective, and then we can move on. Very interesting. Love to try it. Anyone?
Do you worry about competitors being on the same truck?
I think what I'm supposed to say is only if their stuff's heavier than mine is or secured more poorly. Not necessarily well representing my organizational interest. I don't necessarily, beyond a certain perspective. We both want things there on time. We both need to have pickups that are on time. My concerns tend to fall in very opposite categories, being either very operational or very financial. You know, I don't wish to share a truck and find out that Joe's company next door is getting a 5% lower rate. I could do it, but I would feel jilted.
I agree. All things remaining equal, you know, if my quality is going up, my service is going up, my price is going down, you know, I'm all for it.
And there needs to be a certain focus on the variabilities, because you are not me. You are not me, so my needs are not always going to be, my needs aren't predictable enough when I have my own truck and my own supplier. So if we have more than one of us with variable needs, then yeah, there needs to be also a broker, some understandings on how it's going to work.
So we do some of that with other OEMs. I mean, you know, a few years ago, I guess we figured out that, you know, other OEMs' car parts don't have cooties. It's okay. You can be in the same cross stock, be on the same truck with them. You know, but it's like anything else, you're competitors, but, you know, you got to kind of have almost a partnership relationship type of approach going into it, because what's going to invariably happen is you're going to learn some lessons, right? And, you know, some of the things we learned is when you hit things like winter storms and you get into crises or suppliers that are behind schedule, you know, what do you do when my supplier holds up the truck on the milk run and they can't get to your supplier, right? You know, what do you do when my suppliers are expediting freight into the cross dock and your freight can't get in, right? So I think the lesson we've learned is it's doable, it works, it can drive waste out, it can drive efficiency, but you gotta have some real firm ground rules, and you really gotta have some good communication with your competitor. Otherwise, you're gonna have a crisis, you're gonna hit some bumps in the road, and you're gonna say it's not worth the trip.
Yeah. I mean, Elliot, I'm pretty sure, well, I know GM shares some cross-stocks, right? It is some cross-stock sharing with other OEMs. I mean, is that also, I mean, how do you resolve the different 3PLs that you might be using in those cases as well? Does it then become a kind of four-way negotiation as opposed to just a, you know, two-way between Chrysler, GM, or whoever it is?
Yeah, in the case where we share cross stocks, the cross stock operator, I would say, acts like a draw area 3PL for both companies, and they're designing the routes that are shared routes. They're giving us the data that then drives, you know, who's using what utilization of the truck routes of the facilities. So I don't think it works any other way. I mean, you can't have two different LLPs designing routes and managing, you know, trucks into a shared cross stock. I think the reason ours is working is, you know, we're sharing the cross stock operator and the LLP operator of that dry area.
Right.
Is the same company.
Right, yeah. Okay, thanks. Any other questions from the audience at this time? There is a question on the feed, the live feed. So to answer your question, Thomas, not only is it being published, it's, you know, being broadcasted globally. But I'm sure we can edit out whatever you'd like. Question is from Germany, actually, a logistics consultant there. The question is to Elliot, but I think it really applies to anyone there. Are you willing to pay a differential in service price for better IT capabilities of a 3PL or LLP?
You know, when the folks next to me were answering the question of, you know, does a tier one need an LLP, I was kind of thinking about why does General Motors use LLPs, right? And it's definitely not a volume or a scale play. I mean, we got plenty of volume ourselves. You know, one of the benefits of being lucky enough to work at General Motors is, you know, if I call a carrier and the caller ID says General Motors, it doesn't matter that it says my name or someone else's, they're going to answer the phone, they're going to talk to us. So I was kind of thinking about, you know, why do we have Ryder and Penske managing our routed network? Why do I have XPO managing, you know, our premium network? And it really comes down to capability, right? And I think you start from what capability do you need in terms of IT? What capability do you need in terms of people? And if I look across just those three LLPs, it's hundreds of people, you know, in the U.S. and Mexico managing this network, and it's millions upon millions of dollars of IT. And when you think about the size of the network that's being managed, I think it's an area where you don't want to be, you know, penny wise and pound foolish. You know, that little tweak to a network the size of ours, you know, you cut a couple of trucks here and there, and you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars a year or millions. So it's the kind of area of the business And I know my LPs are sitting here saying, how come Elliot never says he adores us? But I think it's the kind of business where the capability comes first, right? Either you got to have it in-house or you got to have it with an LLP, and that's going to pay back dividends, you know, in the way you manage your freight. So I know from our perspective, it starts with the capability, and, you know, the LLPs that we work with, you know, they give us a fair price, they give us cost transparency. So I guess the answer to the question is, we're willing to pay the right price for the capability that we need.
Maybe that answers it for everyone there, but perhaps to back up one on the question is, can you guys talk a little bit about the systems that you are using? I mean, do you have a TMS? Do you use your suppliers? Are you looking at something that can be globally linked? Or, yeah, anyone who wants to talk about that? Oh, I just said whoever was willing to actually comment on it first. But Elliot, how about you?
I'll comment because, you know, we have a homegrown TMS system that we had built, and I can speak that we've recognized that we've pushed it to the limit of what it can do and what we need to do. We've done an RFQ for a new TMS system, and we didn't feel that the bang for the buck is there, not because of what the systems can do, but because of the quality of data that I can put in it to do it. So I think there's still problems on our side. We have 28 sites in North America, and we're running basically 28 independent ERP systems. So trying to get that, what's today's demand, what's today's shipment information to reach that next step of optimization is going to be very difficult, very expensive. And so putting up the kind of six-figure numbers for a system, you know, am I going to be able to pull $500,000 out year one? It's like, oh, you know, I don't know, because our freight's not that complex. A lot of truckload freight. Our consolidation is already, you know, it's already good. You know, we already have milk runs, we already have consolidations. So are we looking at how am I routing UPS boxes?
Right.
You know, I don't know that I'm going to get the bang for the buck.
Right.
I'd like to offer that, and I'm waiting. I would like to see a little bit of audience participation and engagement here. We have a TMS for free. We call it Excel. I'm sorry, no. Actually, our company runs off of SAP. It's an interesting question because we're actually very clear that we would not and do not wish to have a TMS system that is going to overlap, supersede, or duplicate our SAP systems. We're very focused on good MRPs, whether it's MRP1, MRP2, and the integration of the financial modules, the planning modules, you know, the various modules of SAP. So we tend to look at a TMS, if you will, more as an external, a service to be provided, exactly like we've talked about here. It does need to be appropriate. I guess one of the interesting things I'd offer is because of that particular philosophy, what we're very interested in is the connections of a TMS system into our own. It would be, and again, in talking with many 3PLs, it's extremely difficult to sell TI. You will not put your TMS system into my plants because that's just not our company's philosophy. What I did want to do is, again, jump on the IT bandwagon because Elliot's touched on it a little bit, and it is a sore subject of mine, is IT is a very broad subject, and I believe we have industry experts here on many viewpoints, whether they are tiers, providers, suppliers, OEMs. And if, I'm telling you, if I had a nickel for every time somebody came in and told me how neat their metric system was and their visibility systems were, I'm probably a fairly hard sell regarding IT in general, because I absolutely insist that the IT has to be focused, and it absolutely goes back to it needs to be appropriate. I value very much visibility systems in IT. But if I look at visibility and it's across the ocean, then the visibility into that piece of the supply chain is either directly related to information I need to have to do an analysis or make a decision, or it needs to be relative to something that we can control interdict a problem, see it happening before it happens. Just seeing something in a GPS going down the road is not necessarily a satisfactory application of IT to me. The same things happened with metric systems. My poor 3PL designed, I think it was 27 different indicators for me in the first year and a half, of which 2 are now surviving. One of them is cost savings, and the second one is on-time performance. And the rest of it became things that I was interested in, maybe at my level, but it wasn't necessarily able to translate to an executive level. Again, I have a theme, and it certainly wasn't able to translate down to a user level. So IT is a very sensitive subject. I think it's a little bit sometimes overused and not well understood to us who would be being asked to pay the money.
From my perspective, what my 3PL manages from a TMS perspective is fine, but what they don't manage, I lose my visibility on. So that's where I think they have the biggest lacking part and what I need to improve on the most. So from that perspective is where I have the biggest problem, I think, is where I lose my visibility and where I think I need the most improvement on.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Are you all still asleep? You are. Well, I have a few more questions, I'm afraid. I mentioned in the beginning that we've been hearing anyway about some supplier capacity issues, some bottlenecks in some places, and I just wanted to hear your company's experience right now. I mean, are you struggling to keep up? Are you seeing places where you're struggling with certain material? Is it leading to more premium freight? How are you managing where you have those specific bottlenecks? So it's an easy one.
Yeah, I'll go first.
Yeah.
So, this has been, I was jokingly, well, maybe not so much jokingly, telling someone out in the hallway, I picked the wrong year to be the inbound logistics manager at GM. I mean, between the weather in the first quarter, the hours of service, the normal struggles through launch, I mean, it's been a pretty tough year for us in terms of premium freight. And then I was kind of looking at some of the pre-questions here, and I was thinking, one of them was, or maybe I read it as, what can tier ones do to help automakers and logistics and vice versa? And you guys manage your own logistics, manage your own supply chains. The hardest part for me is when a tier one can't ship on time, right? And there's also this gray area between premium freight and normal routed transportation, where you plan 20 trucks a week, based on 4 a day, based on these guys shipping every 3 hours. And lo and behold, the first truck got there at 9 and is still there at 4 in the afternoon. And now everything's just, chaotic. And instead of running 20 trucks, you're running 30 trucks, and it's not showing up as premium freight, and your boss is threatening to fire you. So that's to me the biggest struggle is when a supplier's behind schedule, can't keep up, and you're in that gray zone between throwing your hands up and saying I can't meet the schedule. Which then generates a whole other process in premium freight, and the guys from XPO come rushing in. Right. But it's that gray zone where you don't throw your hands up and say, I can't keep up, but you can't load and release the truck on time. That's one of the biggest challenges for us.
Yeah. Everything Elliot said is, in fact, for today, identical for the Tier 1. I learned more this winter about international transportation, port stoppages. I could tell you what the Port of Hamburg was doing on a daily basis because how it was interrupting my supply chain flow, where the delays were, how to find a crane to get it off Norfolk Southern in the Detroit rail yard because the sea container was owned by the supplier on a DDP delivery, but they couldn't manage from Germany to actually get it off the train in Detroit. So for bargain $12,000, we went and did it ourselves. In the same respect, I also had a comment with our purchasing director trying to explain to him how within the concept of price increases, it was just glorious working through the last 3 years. And by the way, we had several 100,000 and we need to set up regularly scheduled meetings. As I and my 3PL explained to you, HOS finally has come around to hit us. E-logs are responding. The contraction of capacity that we were all reading about in Texas 5 years ago at the automotive collapse has in fact synergized with an improvement in the market, and now you couldn't buy a truck for love nor money without 3 months worth of notice. We have the identical situation as far as what is the difference between adding a truck, subtracting a truck versus expediting a truck. And yes, we have some suppliers who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn door on a pickup time and have had carriers that said, we no longer wish to pick up your X-Works lane because your supplier must be managed because they cannot hit a pickup window like a broadside of a barn door, and the resourcing and et cetera. So it's been an absolutely educational year for us in almost the identical respects, probably a smaller scale.
One of the first questions I ask carriers, first of all, is all your capacity dedicated to General Motors? Because then I know I'm not going to get a truck. I'm going to be the second one or the third one that gets a truck. But what we've done is, one, we try to stay away from brokers because we know that then you don't have any control of who's going to bump your dock. It could be anybody with any qualification. So we try to work with carriers that actually have their own assets. But because some of my locations...
I'd like to jump in and say now I understand, because we also were moving away from brokerages and trying to find more asset-based, and apparently he took your stuff, but you took my stuff.
Maybe so. But, because a lot of our plants are in rather remote locations, what we found ourselves getting in the habit of when we were visiting our plants is actually writing down the names on the sides of the trucks that we see in town. And then we started to research some of these smaller carriers that aren't 300 trucks. There might be a local carrier that I wouldn't consider a core carrier, but they're in an area that's very hard to service. So we'd actually fly down to this area, and we would write down the names of trucks and do some research on where they were based, who was based in that town, and look for some companies that had 5, 6, 7 trucks, and they're interested in a couple of repetitive, dedicated lanes that we need drivers on that happen, like clockwork. And we were able to find, in some cases, and in some areas, it's a farm that had, extra equipment, and he started a trucking company specifically to service my plant, and he's doing 10 or 12 loads a week. And he never fails, but I'm his best and biggest customer. And we had to work hard to find him. And so you look for ways, and I've heard this a couple times during this session, or not this one particular, but over the course of the this group meeting, is that it's still about people and creating a relationship where a carrier wants to do business with you and makes you a customer of choice, and you put together a good plan, good measures, good metrics, and a good relationship. He'll take care of you before he takes care of the customer that treats him poorly. And having been on both sides of the table as a carrier, actually as a driver, as a carrier, and as a buyer of transportation, I can tell you the people that treat you well, you work harder for. And I think that's the case now. And when it's hard to find good carriers and hard to get good drivers, the drivers want to be on the moves that happen every day, the same time. There's no problem, there's no hassles. They like to be on those routes. If you can get them home every night, all the better. And if you can, treat their owners with respect and as partners and help them grow, they're going to stick with you for a while.
Mike, I made a note. Look for the farmers with trucks. I got that.
I can second what Mike says as well, is it's important to be intimate with your carriers. And people think I'm crazy, but I'll snapshot trucks as I'm driving down the side of the road. I'll be the first one out there writing their numbers down or their IDs on the side. They probably think I'm stalking them, actually. They probably have actually called their dispatch and said, this lady's crazy, she's taking my picture. But I've always done that since I was in dispatch when I first started out. That's how I've got hundreds of carriers' names and numbers. I'll be the first one to call my truck driver who's 2 a.m. with a hot load and ask him, are you doing okay? Are you okay? Where are you at? What mile road are you on? And he'll actually say, oh my God, are you okay? Am I late? And I'll say, no, how are you, Bob? And he'll say, you're the customer. Customers don't call me. And I'll say, well, actually, I am calling you. You have a hot load. I want to make sure you're okay. And that's the kind of stuff that I think makes that partnership that I mentioned before really work. And he makes sure my load gets there on time, and in fact, 2 hours early. And that's what keeps my lines running and even quicker. Some of the stresses that you asked about before, the pain points that I'm seeing right now, then things like that are U.S. to South Africa. We started up business in South Africa. Seems to be a wonderful place that we are shipping to right now, but there's not a whole lot of lanes that have availability. So that's one of my pain points right now. India to Brazil is a pain point for me right now as well, and capacity, supplier capacity is one of the things that we're struggling with as well.
Thank you. I do like the idea of all of you like train spotters, but like truck spotters out on the road.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
I would actually like to, I'm going to step in for a second because I'm going to be a naysayer. I actually very much understand I don't necessarily agree with my cohorts or my partners. Are you all comfortable with this? Again, understanding the model that we are moving from, we actually have a carrier agreement, not an agent agreement. And that carrier agreement was by choice, where legacies may have been brought in, but we are not necessarily equipped to handle, again, as a developing logistics, carrier transportation and management. That's a big chunk for either the the tiers that do it or themselves or 3PLs. What I'm going to offer is sometimes I'm under a lot of stress internal to my organization as I work downward, because my approach is I cannot and don't wish to continue having, absolutely no offense, the concept of a hot load continue pulling back into my manufacturing chain. We have enough difficulties connecting manufacturing and transportation within the supply chain and materials planning to where, for a period of time, I think it's very important to be able to put structure around the transportation, and too much of the small local carriers I found in trying to break the paradigm was doing nothing but perpetuating the internal black hole of manufacturing, production, scheduling, because you were able to get, you know, Joe's trucking company, who only had 50 trailers or, you know, did farm equipment. I'm laughing because Chrysler did criticize our company once for having hay in the semis and on our headliners. It did. I'm not kidding. We got DMRs and had to sort for 2 months because we had hay on the headliners. At worst case, I'd offer there's a balance in my perspective because, once again, we're in supply chain. Logistics is supply chain. So there's an interaction between the small local carriers, your shipping dock, and your manufacturing. And it's there. Trust me, it's there. And if it's not standardized and have some structure, and then I think you're never going to really get your hands around the supply chain.
Can I respond? You know, you're right in many ways. We've pulled actually the decision making on how often you can grab a local carrier away from the plant. So the plant doesn't, they don't have any decision making about when that truck arrives or how often they can use it. And the majority of times when there are hot loads, it's not the fault of a supplier. It's actually our own issue, and it converts over to a premium situation where we manage it. We do try to use major carriers for our hot, you know, our biggest lanes. So down to Mexico and such, we're using big carriers. But we've got plants in Gaylord, Michigan, and it would cost me a fortune to get a truck up there. I've got plants, in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and so there isn't. It's not like all my plants are in Chicago where there's 80,000 trucks a night. Sometimes it's just challenging to find a truck. So you create a solution, and that's where we've done it. It's on a exception basis, but we've had to create a solution where there was a problem that we needed to solve. So that's what we did.
Okay, thank you.
Creative logistics.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I appreciate, I think, the perspective of both sides of needing to, I mean, literally, you know, get on the road and kind of find your own solution. Perhaps you would have hoped that that would have been something that a transportation specialist would do, like you know, a 3PL or an LLP or something, but I don't know, I guess sometimes we all have to get our hands dirty, so. Any questions from the audience? Maybe a last point from my side. And I started with Elliot, and you know I'm not stitching you up because, you know, I just spoke with Edgar, and it's a topic we discussed. So GM has been quite vocal about one of its strategies in North America is to bring suppliers closer where possible to its plants. And it sounds very logical, but obviously it's not simple at all. And I wondered what the logistics considerations are from your team, and then I'd like perhaps the tier suppliers to reflect on that too, in terms of other OEMs are putting these sort of, you know, demands on them as well.
Yeah, one of the things I found out, Chris, is we're pretty mature in terms of total enterprise cost at GM, you know, and you never really know where you stand, you know, until you start talking to some others. But, you know, we had a vision of moving suppliers closer. That happened to some degree, and in a lot of cases it didn't happen. But what is happening is every one of the decisions of where to source parts for our programs is made on a total enterprise cost basis. So we're looking at the piece price, we're looking at freight, customs, we're looking at, you know, things amortized over 2 life cycles of programs, and there's times where it just doesn't make sense. There's times where the cost advantage of producing a part not right next door to your plant is the right total cost decision, even if it means you're going to spend more on freight. So, you know, I think that's kind of where the journey's led us, is we have, I'd say, a very rigorous, very robust process where it's more than just calculating what's the freight. You know, there's gyration upon gyration of, is there another way to make this work? Is there another way to amortize capital? Is there another way to make the business equation answer come out to move closer? And there's times where the answer just is going to be no, that freight is better than a higher piece price.
Yeah. I mean, have you, any of it from the tier supplier's perspective, have you, I mean, did you have that capability in your supply chain to potentially influence or that, and do you feel the pressure from ultimately your customers to do that?
You know, we definitely feel the pressure on total cost, and you know, we have a meeting every Friday to discuss new suppliers and why are we bringing this new supplier, what's the impact on the supply chain. And in North America, we haven't had a meeting in 3 months because we haven't had any new suppliers considered for 3 months. So we're really developing our core strategy for every commodity. But as a tier, you know, we're faced with an additional total cost challenge because we're not only looking at what our supply cost is, but we're looking at our manufacturing cost, where we're manufacturing it, and what the impact is to our customer when we make something at a certain location. Because it happens all the time where we consider moving a program from one plant to another plant, and the first question that comes up is, what's this going to cost our customer in transportation? Because we know that if we move something 5 miles further, General Motors is going to ask for a piece price reduction, because that's what you do. And so we're always looking, okay, with any change that we make, what is the impact on our total cost? Will we be saving money? What's the impact on the customer? And will our savings allow us to actually, contribute to an LTA agreement to our customer? Because that's what we're trying to accomplish, and make sure there's not a negative effect, at all for our customer. So you're really trying to, manage more than just your inbound. You're trying to manage your, the impact on your outbound. And if we don't have that answers when we sit down, you're going to ask it, and we've got to come back with it.
Yeah, I think it's what suppliers are capable as well. It's not as easy just saying this supplier can do the same thing. It's what suppliers are capable of the move. Engineering support has to agree with it. It is the total cost. I think we've said that a few times across the board in the last hours. Total cost, total cost. Picking up and moving it. GM, Ford, Chrysler, everybody across the board, all customers will expect some kind of cost reduction for that. So it does come down to total cost across the board.
Great. You going to agree or disagree?
You know me, that's a real pickle. There's a couple of questions, or there's a couple of assumptions I think we're talking about. Number one is if we're talking about relocating the supply base, talking about a strategic planning, then you're assuming, or I would be assuming, that the first question to ask is it relative to the Incoterm? Because if it is an FCA or the old X-Works or something like that, then yes, a total landed cost is fairly easy to calculate. Bless our hearts, and we have LLPs to do so. Again, one of the dilemmas of a tier equally has to do with, we do have directed suppliers. Furthermore, we have directed suppliers where we have FCA pricing, the supplier's directed, but we own the transportation. So in this, yes, we follow the instructions and the wishes of the company. But the third one that I think I'm just going to call out the elephant in the room is when you are managing a supply base in logistics that is not FCA, we have to recognize that logistics is the last bastion of skullduggery in our margins, and that penetrating a supplier's cost for logistics is quite a challenge. It is a different use of the data that can be provided connecting with an LLP or possibly with an OEM. But once again, there's 2 or 3 different things that are going on there. So I do know that we equally have a focus on total landed cost, that we war and conflict and have meetings trying to evaluate a purchase piece price versus a landed cost versus an Incoterm. And there's 2 or 3 different avenues you have to approach.
And I think that's a good note to end on. Logistics is the last bastion of skullduggery. I was always hoping that sentence would get said at a conference of ours. No, but I think the fact that it is very complex, and some of these cost decisions aren't perhaps as black and white as they might appear on paper, and that will probably keep us keeping these kind of discussions going for a long time. But I really want to give our panel a round of applause. I think it was a great discussion. They were very open and honest. They did great, even though we asked them last minute. We're going to have a short coffee break, 10, 12 minutes as we break the room, or probably reunite the room. Stick around because we've got some heavy hitters on with, I think, Ford and Chrysler, probably people in this room who don't even know they're going to be on stage if Louis gets sight of them. So stick around, and we look forward to finishing the conference out with you.
I am going to go stand next to